For years, the question sat quietly in the background, unasked, unanswered, but always there. Where did the money go? Not just any money, but the Coyote Pass money, the promises, the shared future, the nest egg everyone believed would finally bring security. And then one day, Meri spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt heavier than shouting. Because when Meri Brown finally admitted what she knew, it wasn't just about missing money. It was about trust that vanished long before the bank balance did. Let's rewind. Coyote Pass was supposed to be the dream. Wide land, fresh start, a symbol that the family could still work. Each wife believed she was investing not just dollars, but loyalty, patience, and years of her life. They were told the money was safe. They were told it was being managed. They were told, just wait. It'll all make sense. But waiting became silence, and silence became suspicion. Meri wasn't always quiet. In the early years, she defended the family harder than anyone. She believed in the structure. She believed in the rules. She believed in the idea that sacrifice would be rewarded. But belief doesn't protect you forever. Slowly, Meri noticed something wasn't adding up. Bills paid here, expenses justified there. Conversations that ended too quickly when finances came up. Every time she asked, the answers were vague. Don't worry about it. It's handled. We'll talk later. Later never came, and that's when the cracks started showing, not in the land, but in the relationships. Meri began to realize she wasn't being included. She was being informed, after decisions were already made. There's a difference. Being included means you have a voice. Being informed means you're expected to accept the outcome. The money discussions started happening without her. Not openly, not honestly. And when Meri pressed, she was made to feel difficult, emotional, disruptive. Sound familiar? That's how silence works. It convinces you that asking questions is the real problem. But here's the thing about Meri. She watches, she remembers, and she doesn't forget patterns. She noticed that while some households struggled, others seemed untouched. While some wives downsized, others upgraded. While some were told to tighten belts, someone else's belt never moved. And still, no clear explanation. Coyote Pass remained undeveloped. Plans changed. Timelines shifted. Excuses stacked on top of excuses. And then came the moment that changed everything. Not a fight, not a blow-up, just a realization. Meri understood that the money wasn't just missing, it had moved, redirected, reprioritized, and she hadn't been part of the decision. That realization hurts in a way words can't explain, because it tells you something painful. You were never meant to be an equal partner. You were meant to comply. When Meri finally spoke about it, her words were careful, measured. But the meaning was unmistakable. She didn't accuse, she didn't shout. She confirmed. The money didn't disappear overnight. It slipped away piece by piece, decision by decision, conversation by conversation, until one day, there was nothing left to question, only consequences. And suddenly, the land wasn't the biggest loss. The trust was. This wasn't just a financial issue, it was emotional, relational, foundational. Because when shared money stops being shared, it exposes everything else that isn't equal. And Meri? She finally stopped pretending otherwise. Once Meri understood that the money hadn't vanished, but had been quietly redirected, everything started to make sense. The delays, the defensiveness, the way financial conversations suddenly felt off limits. Because money doesn't move on, its own. Someone decides where it goes. And that's when the picture became clearer. Meri began connecting moments she had brushed off before. Small comments, side remarks, decisions explained after the fact, not before. At the time, she told herself, it was just complicated family logistics. Big families were messy. Shared finances were confusing, but confusion shouldn't feel secretive. What Meri finally admitted, carefully but honestly, was that the money meant for Coyote Pass wasn't protected as a shared asset. It was treated like a flexible resource that benefited some more than others. She noticed that certain expenses were always approved without hesitation. Certain priorities were always met, and certain people never had to wait. Meanwhile, she was told to be patient, to trust the process, to believe in the long-term plan. But the long-term plan kept changing. At some point, Meri realized she wasn't waiting for the land to be developed. She was waiting for transparency that was never coming. That's when she stopped asking where the money was going and started asking who was deciding, because control tells the real story. The family structure had always been presented as equal: 4 wives, 1 shared future, 1 financial vision. But behind the scenes, that balance no longer existed. Some decisions were made in private, some conversations happened without everyone present, and some money was spent with confidence, because approval was guaranteed. Meri wasn't part of that inner circle anymore, and the most painful part? She wasn't told she had been excluded. She figured it out on her own. That's a quiet kind of betrayal, the kind that doesn't explode. It settles. When Meri finally admitted what she knew, she didn't list dollar amounts. She didn't point fingers. She acknowledged something more powerful. The money followed influence, and influence had shifted. The family talked about sacrifice, but only certain people were expected to make it. They talked about unity, but unity had conditions. They talked about fairness, but fairness depended on who was asking. Meri realized that her contributions, financial and emotional, were still expected. But her voice wasn't. That imbalance doesn't just drain a bank account. It drains a person. She had invested years believing that loyalty would be returned in kind, that shared money meant shared respect. Instead, she watched as the shared future slowly narrowed into someone else's comfort. Coyote Pass became symbolic, not of hope, but of avoidance. Every unfinished plan was another reminder that the money wasn't coming back. Because it had already been spent, just not on her future. And that's when Meri stopped framing it as confusion. She called it what it was, a shift in priorities. When asked why she stayed quiet for so long, her answer wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. Fighting for transparency inside a system designed to avoid it takes a toll, especially when you're told that asking questions makes you disloyal. So Meri did what many people do when they realize the rules have changed without warning. She pulled back, she observed, and eventually, she detached. Because once you understand that the money was never really missing, you understand something even harder. It was never meant to be equal. The family didn't fall apart because of Coyote Pass. Coyote Pass exposed what had already fallen apart, and Meri's admission wasn't about blame, it was about clarity. She finally said out loud what had been unspoken for years. The money went where the power already was. And once that truth settled in, there was no going back. No rewriting the past, no rebuilding trust that had quietly eroded. Only one option remained: choosing herself. After Meri admitted the truth, carefully, calmly, but unmistakably, something shifted. Not in the family meetings, not in the public statements, but in her. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The money hadn't just moved. It had been decided, and Meri realized that every unanswered question she had ever asked wasn't ignored by accident. It was ignored by design. From the outside, it still looked like confusion. Delays, paperwork, complicated logistics. But inside the family, things had quietly reorganized. Decision-making power wasn't shared anymore. It was centralized, and Meri wasn't part of that center. She began replaying moments from years earlier, times when she had raised concerns, times when she had been told, "We'll figure it out later." Later never came. Instead, money was used to stabilize one household, to secure one lifestyle, to protect one vision of comfort. Meanwhile, Meri's future stayed vague. Coyote Pass became a holding pattern, a promise that justified inaction. Every time Meri asked when development would begin, the answer shifted. Every time she asked about funds, the conversation ended. What she finally admitted, without dramatics, was that the family finances had turned into leverage. If you agreed, things flowed smoothly. If you questioned, things stalled. That's not partnership. That's control, and Meri felt it most sharply when she stopped contributing emotionally. That's when the warmth disappeared, because as long as she was giving, financially, emotionally, symbolically, she was tolerated. Once she pulled back, she became inconvenient. Her role had changed, not officially, but functionally. She was no longer a decision maker, she was an asset. That realization doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with clarity, and clarity hurts. Meri didn't confront anyone publicly. She didn't demand repayment. She didn't create a scene. She did something quieter and more powerful. She disengaged. She stopped waiting for plans that never moved forward. She stopped expecting transparency from a system built on silence. She stopped believing that loyalty would eventually be rewarded, because she finally admitted something to herself. The money wasn't coming back, and neither was the trust. Coyote Pass had become a symbol of false hope, a dream used to keep people invested, without delivering anything tangible in return. And Meri understood that if she stayed emotionally tied to that dream, she would keep losing. So she changed the rules. She stopped explaining herself, stopped over-justifying her distance, stopped trying to earn fairness from people who benefited from imbalance. That's when the dynamic shifted again. Suddenly, her absence was noticed. Suddenly, her independence felt threatening. Because when someone stops participating in a system that quietly advantages others, it exposes the system, and Meri had become living proof that the arrangement wasn't mutual anymore. Her admission wasn't dramatic, it was definitive. The money followed power, and power no longer included her. Coyote Pass wasn't unfinished, because of bad luck. It was unfinished because finishing it no longer served everyone equally. And once Meri understood that, she did something the system never anticipated. She stopped needing permission. She invested in herself. Built her own stability, created distance, not out of bitterness but out of self-preservation. That's not quitting, that's opting out. And here's the part that makes her admission so powerful. She didn't demand accountability from the people who controlled the money. She demanded it from herself. She asked one question that changed everything. Why am I still trusting a system that has shown me who it protects? Once she answered that honestly, the rest followed naturally. Silence, distance, boundaries. Those weren't signs of weakness, they were signs of clarity. And that's why her admission matters. Because it wasn't about exposing numbers. It was about exposing priorities. The money went exactly where it was meant to go, just not where she was promised. Meri didn't leave with an argument. There was no dramatic announcement, no slammed doors, no final showdown over money or land. She left quietly, and that's what made it impossible to ignore. By the time Meri fully stepped away, the emotional distance had already been there for years. What changed wasn't the situation. It was her acceptance of it. She had stopped waiting for fairness, stopped waiting for acknowledgement, stopped waiting for the future she had been promised. Because waiting had become a trap. Coyote Pass was still talked about in vague terms, still referenced as someday, still used as proof that the family was connected. But Meri knew better now. A future that never arrives isn't a plan. It's a distraction, and once she saw that clearly, she stopped participating in the illusion. Her withdrawal wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. She stopped asking for updates, stopped chasing conversations that went nowhere, stopped pretending the financial arrangement still made sense. That's when her absence became noticeable, because systems built on quiet compliance struggle when someone simply stops complying. There were no accusations from Meri, but there were reactions from others. Confusion, defensiveness, sudden concern. Not because she was leaving emotionally, but because she was leaving financially and symbolically. Her presence had always added legitimacy. Her investment had always helped hold the structure together. Without her, the imbalance was harder to hide. That's when the story subtly shifted. The unfinished land stopped being about timing and started being about circumstances. The missing money stopped being discussed altogether. The focus moved away from accountability, and Meri didn't chase it back because she understood something crucial. You don't get closure from people who benefited from your confusion. You get closure by choosing yourself. Her final admission wasn't spoken in one sentence. It was expressed through action. She stopped centering her life around a future that excluded her, stopped shaping her choices around people who had already moved on. She didn't reclaim the money. She reclaimed her agency, and that mattered more. Coyote. Pass remained unfinished, but Meri's clarity didn't. She no longer needed explanations, because explanations wouldn't change the outcome. The money went where it went. The power sat where it sat. What mattered was where she stood now, and she stood outside the system. That's what made her exit so powerful. Not anger, not revenge, but refusal. Refusal to keep believing a story that no longer included her. Refusal to keep investing in promises that only flowed one way. Refusal to confuse loyalty with self-erasure. In a family that thrived on togetherness as an image, Meri choosing independence was radical. It exposed the truth without saying a word. Because when someone quietly walks away from shared finances, shared dreams, and shared narratives, it forces a question no one wants to answer. If the system was fair, why didn't it survive without her sacrifice? That question still hangs over Coyote Pass. Unbuilt, unresolved, uncomfortable. And Meri doesn't need to point at it. Her life speaks for itself now. She didn't take the money back, but she stopped letting it define her worth. She didn't demand justice, but she demanded peace. And that's the ending no one expected. Not a confession, not a confrontation. Just a woman stepping out of a story that stopped honoring her.